talk today is on crime and punishment in Lone Star State. And let me tell you a little bit about my background so you'll understand where I'm coming from as I give my presentation. I'm actually a criminal justice professor from Sam Houston State University, so my training is not in history. So be patient with me because, you know, what's happened through the years is we've lived different areas, everywhere from Alpine to Houston. We're one of those people, and my husband's here today, that we would go on a family drive, and we stop and read every darn historical marker out there. I grew up that way. My family did that. I don't know how many picnics I had at Gettysburg and Valley Forge, and you know, it's like that's what you did on a Sunday afternoon. You went out and had fried chicken at one of the local state parks. So as you can tell, I've moved around a lot, and as you can also tell by my voice, I'm just a little bit nervous this morning because it's a different type of group that I'm talking to than students. I know probably some of y'all know more than I do on some of the topics that I'll touch on today, and I know that. So please be polite and don't correct me in front of the whole audience. You know, if you've done historic research, what this to me is a learning experience because I'm not a historian. So, you know, you go look something up and you're standing there reading that marker and you go, you know, this is really interesting, I'm going to find out more about this. Well, you find all kinds of conflicting stories. And the problem that I have, just like when we go on a Sunday drive and we stop and we read every marker, so that my daughter goes, why is it taking you 5 hours to get home from Albany? Really, we've gotten those phone calls, are y'all okay? It's like, oh no, we stopped at a cemetery, and you know, all those little bitty stops that y'all love to do too. So that's the problem that I have when I'm doing research, because I'm not trained to focus. So when I'm working down at the Historic Commission in town, I'm on the Taylor County Historic Commission, and we've got a quasi research area, you know, we've collected all kinds of books and old newspapers and stuff, and I go, well, I'm going to look up what happened in 1895. Well, I open up the newspaper. Oh, big mistake. You know, because I don't focus on what I'm supposed to. Instead, I'm reading all these articles like, just for example, January 13th, 1884. So you want to know what's going on in the 1800s. This one actually came out of the New York Times. And this is what I'm saying, so you get kind of sidetracked. If you're looking for information, historic information, and I'm just telling you my journey, a lot of times you can't find the old newspapers. I just asked the young man in the bookshop, I said, when did they stop publishing the Buffalo Gap Messenger? And he said, you mean that paper that they put out here? I said, no, not that thing. I'm not trying to offend him, but not that paper. The real newspaper for Buffalo Gap. He said, I didn't even know there was one. So when you go back and you're trying to find stuff that happened in the 1800s, where do you go to for research? You go to the New York Times. You go to the Galveston Post or Tribune, I can't remember what it was. But you go to the big newspapers. You go to Dallas, because that's where all the news was sent. And it's kind of cool. But at the same time, you wind up with all these little blurbs, like this one says. This was January 13th, 1884. It went to Galveston, Texas. That was the big newspaper because a lot of immigrants came through there. Near the Colorado River last night, a San Angelo stage, southbound, was halted by 4 mounted men who robbed the mail sacks and passengers and then delayed the coach until the arrival of a northbound stage, which they also plundered. So they're just going to sit there and get them across the road. There was a large amount of registered matter in the southbound coach, and it is believed the thieves made a heavy haul. That's the extent. Yeah, really. There was one that I really loved because it's talking about another stage that was robbed. And this was 1885, the Highlandman's Way. Citizens of Ampasas, who were passengers on the stage from San Angelo to Abilene today, gave the following account of a daring robbery 17 miles this side of Runnels. Now realize this is, you know, I'm just leading you into some other topics. A smooth-faced boy, about 18 years of age, met and passed the stage. He was riding a fine gray horse, was coatless, I get a really good description here, wore a blue flannel shirt, pants and boots, and carried a Winchester and 6-shooter. After passing the stage, he turned and demanded him to halt. The driver whipped his team and raced half a mile ensued before the stage stopped. The highwayman demanded the mail sack, saying he did not care to assess the passenger a lady. So he just wanted the mail sacks. He wasn't robbing the passengers. The sacks were given to him, and then at this point he carries them approximately 200 yards out on the prairie and leisurely appropriates what he wants. So the passengers are all standing there watching this. While this scene was being enacted, the stage from Abilene to San Angelo drove up with 7 male passengers. Weapons being called for, a man who claimed to be a ranger en route to Runnels as a witness loaded his pistol, buckled on his belt, and awaited development. So he just standing there watching this. The robber, after satisfying himself, rode off and left the rifled bags on the prairie. Officers left for the locality tonight. The full facts will be obtainable tomorrow. So it's kind of interesting. You get another stage shows up with armed men on it, and they're just all standing there going, you know. So that's the fun thing. You're looking at a newspaper for something, and you find all these articles and that kind of stuff. So if you do like to read those kind of articles, you can go to something like the New York Times online, and you can enter your search parameters, like you want to read stuff before 1890, and put in a few what you're looking for, and it'll pull up all kinds of stuff. Especially, you wouldn't think, oh, from Abilene? Yeah, because that was one of the major cities then. So think about when you're looking at your time frame, what comes back. All right, so, no, it's not all going to be like this, I promise, okay? But when you're looking at, from my viewpoint, I want to do research on the criminal justice system in Texas. This is just a little thumbnail real quick. Realize, any of y'all looking at this, you've got everything from the police and law enforcement to the court system to the correction system. So, as we go through this, I decided to hang my historical framework on what I consider your standard criminal justice system to kind of help give some guidance to me. So, as a researcher, you can step into any of these. Realize you've also got, if you remember your basic criminal justice system, you've got the federal level, you've got the state level, you've got the county level, you've got the city level, you've got federal crimes, you've got civil crimes. You can look at the courts, you can look at jails and prisons, you can look at the law enforcement aspect out here in the West, you can look at the victims. So there's a lot of ways that you can go. So you can see that when I started 20 years ago just looking at jails in Texas, because we like to go on little trips, let's go over and look at the Belleville. We live in Houston at a particular time. Let's go to Belleville and look at the Austin County Jail. Let's go to Albany and look at the Shackelford Jail. I mean, so that kind of stuff, you know, you get there and there's all these other stories besides just the architecture. When I walked here today, I stopped and looked at our little jail here, and I walked upstairs because I remember reading somewhere that the Buffalo Gap Jail still has one of the dry sewers that works. So if you stand outside the jail on this side, you can see a big pipe running down. If you go upstairs, that's the little privy inside the jail cell, which actually was a pretty advanced piece of equipment. If you think about the time period, most people were going literally, they were pissing in a pot, which meant somebody had to clean it up. This one, you had a little toilet to the outside. So someone didn't have to take someone out to an outhouse, or they didn't have to go in a pot, that kind of stuff. So it's kind of interesting, just the basic structure. Also, when you look at Texas itself, it has an unusual history in that we've been under many different flags, right? So if you're looking at something like the history of jails in Texas, you can go all the way back to the Spanish, the Mexicans, the different influences that came in. So you have that whole, where do I start? And a lot of the stuff goes back. Because even when we were under control of Mexico, we did have jails and they had courts. So there was a whole system there that was established. That kind of information is very difficult to get, though, unless you actually travel to either Austin or some of the cities in Mexico that have those kind of records. So it's kind of cool. But so many different things that you can go with. So you can see how when you're trying to do a presentation, it's like, where do I want to focus for y'all? All right. So, early American law enforcement. To go back to the East Coast, and I'm not going to take you there that long. If you go back to the East Coast, early American law enforcement started in New York, Philadelphia, Boston, all those cities that brought their system to the United States from Europe. So in the early 1900s, while you have police developing in the major cities, remember what's going on in the American West. What do we have? Nothing. But we'll see they also wind up patterning in this you know what I'm saying? Thank you. We wind up styling our police departments in the major cities just like New York and Boston. But until you have government in a particular territory, you're not going to have this kind of police department. Okay? In rural areas, as you left the cities, typically your sheriff and the constable were your big law enforcement. That's what you come through with the frontier west. Right? It's really not until we have the federal system come in that we start seeing judicial districts, all that kind of stuff. All right? So what we see in the 1800s, early 1800s, on the East Coast is this type of police department developed. Paddy wagon actually was a term that came from the fact that when you look at Boston, those cities, you had a high group of immigrants that were Irish, and they were called insultingly Patricks, which translated to paddy wagon. So that's where that term paddy wagon that you hear comes from. So as we go along, you know, yeah, there you go. In the South, the earliest form of policing was slave patrols. Very organized. Not real proud of that fact today, most of us aren't. But that was very organized because of the money that went with the large plantations. Now, actually, in Texas also, and in federal areas, the federal sheriffs, wait a minute, let me repeat this, the marshals, they had to enforce these laws too. As long as there was a slave state, they were enforcing it. So, there's our southern, and this was an actual, they got little badges, everything. I mean, it was real organized. You wouldn't have thought so. Okay? So this was U.S. slavery in the 1850s. And as you can see, you have a lot of different things going on here, which impacts your law enforcement, and it impacts the citizens themselves. Because not only do you have law enforcement, you have the social changes, you have the Civil War coming on, and who's enforcing what laws. When Texas was brought into, came under Mexico, they said no slavery in Texas. The Mexicans did. However, they didn't stop you from bringing your slaves with you. So you couldn't import them, but you could bring them with you as part of your family. So early Texas did have slavery too. All right, so that's just kind of, so you can see where we were in the 1800s. All right. Until a territory was recognized by the United States and became a state, it fell under federal jurisdiction. So you had U.S. Marshals enforcing a lot of this. And this is why when you watch old Westerns, you're going, is he a marshal? Is he a sheriff? Is he a deputy? It is real confusing because as you saw, you have all those different systems from federal down to county and city. And then you have civil and jurisdictions, criminal and civil. It all gets real confusing. Even today it is. You know? All right. And we all know federal law enforcement today, we know it is the FBI, DEA, all those kind of agencies. Now, what I did was yesterday, I went in and stuck in a couple extra slides because I wanted you to be a little more aware of the federal law enforcement agencies. So the U.S. Marshals were our first federal law enforcement agency. Okay? And they typically kept law and order in an area, in a territory, until it became a state. Now, they still had jurisdiction once it became a state because it was federal. So you get these overlapping things. So you have federal law enforcement, you have a state. With the state, you see state policing come in. Then you have a county recognized, you'll see county police come in, county sheriffs come in. And then on top of that, you'll have a city, and they'll have city police. So this is why when there's a crime, you know, it's like everybody shows up, depending on what happened. All right. Now, I'm going to start federal and work my way down to the local, and I'll also be hitting some of the local stuff, so bear with me. And I try not to talk quite so fast, all right? Deputy Bass Reeves, he worked for, let me think about this a second, because I put this in a different place than I originally wanted. He was actually one of the first black men who was appointed to a federal judge. The deputies enforced the laws that the courts had in a particular area. This man worked under the Western District of Arkansas and Eastern District of Texas. That covered this area too. Okay? So you had deputies that were enforcing the laws, and as you can see, they weren't always real popular. But one of the reasons this Eastern District covered, and we'll come back to the judge that he worked for, it covered a lot of the Indian nations. So no one wanted to work in the Indian nations, except in many cases black men. So that's why you see a lot of the frontiers, you'll see black men where white men don't want to go. So it's kind of interesting. The Native Americans typically liked working with the blacks too, because they saw the blacks as mistreated too. So it's like, all right, fellow, someone who's in the same boat we are, but in a different way. But his name, now you can actually go to the U.S. Federal Marshal site, and there's some really cool history about the different deputies that worked in these frontier areas. But like I told you, I'm just giving you a little bit and hoping that you go, oh, you know what, that was interesting. I'm going to go back and read some more about that guy. All right, so that's what my purpose is here today. It's not to give you statement enough material for a test. So I'm just kind of hitting the highlights for you. All right, so in the West, before a state, we had the federal. Okay. Now, I thought this was kind of fun. Gone to Texas, and I haven't seen this in years. And this is what part of when you're looking for stuff. I was looking for some pictures to put up for y'all because I didn't want to stand up here with slide after slide with writing on it. And I'm going, oh my God, this one is driving me crazy. I forgot this term, gone to Texas. Right? So you have the social forces that are going on across the United States where people are moving into an area. Of course, in the early years of Texas, you have the Indians that you're trying to come in and settle with, and you're fighting with them. Later on, as these people come settling in, they're ignoring a lot of the decrees from Mexico when it was under Mexican control. But whites are moving in anyway. You had a lot of blacks that moved in too. Let me backtrack. When it was under Mexico's control, you couldn't have slaves. So quite often, you brought your slaves in, but what happened because of the laws, after a certain period of time, you had to turn them loose. So you had to free them. It was written into Mexican law. The way that a lot of slave owners got around that was they made them sign papers and made them indentured servants. So you have someone who's illiterate and hadn't signed in, there are 99-year indentured servants. But a lot of the plantation owners or the big farmers, they released their slaves when they were supposed to. And of course, they turn around and settle in the community too. So we really had a very diverse population out here, which is really cool. All right, so we got federal. Once you have Texas recognized as a state, you have to have law enforcement. Texas, our state police model is the Texas Rangers. We all know that. And I didn't want to spend a lot of time on them, but a little bit. Because there's some fascinating books out there. And in case you haven't been to our bookstore here, they have really cool books on the Rangers and all that kind of information out there. Internet these days, you can find everything. But just like me, when you're looking at history information on the internet, a lot of times you're trying to figure out where that information came from. Because it may conflict, the dates may conflict. When the Texas Rangers formed, they have a really, really cool history because they weren't always nice guys. Even today, we don't always consider them nice guys. But they picked their own men, so you could pick people who supported whatever it is you wanted to do, and they could dress as they chose, and they didn't even have a badge. This is a really old print, and this came from the Texas Rangers Historic Site. So they have a site that's really cool. They originally developed in reaction to all the Indian raids, right? But quite often, stories are, they made them worse because they didn't know what was going on, and they just go in. And so they would make an Indian situation quite often worse, but that's just part of the history. They were also charged with helping to protect the railroads coming through in the early days. They were supposed to stop crimes in smaller cities. Prize fighting, for some reason, was a big issue. I didn't follow that thread, but apparently the Texas Rangers shut down a lot of prize fighting in the 1800s. I don't know why this was such an issue. Someone find out for me. But it's kind of one of those little things that you want, really? Why did they spend all that time doing that? And there's some really good stories. That's where that one story comes from, where you're reading about where they have the prize fight down in the middle of the Pecos River because they can't have it on Texas soil. And I mean, it's all these kind of things, right? Right? And actually, this one, who's Bill McDonald, he's the one who you all associate with the phrase, one riot, one ranger. You've heard that, right? He got that because he went to, let me make sure I get the city right here because someone will correct me. I think he went to El Paso. Oh, Dallas, there we go. And they had a scheduled prize fight. And he was supposed to go break it up. And he was the only one that got off the train. And the mayor goes, "Where's everybody else?" And he said, "Hell, ain't not enough. There's only one prize fight." So that's where that saying that you hear, one fight, one ranger, one riot. That's all you need. There's one riot, so you only need one ranger, right? So evidently prize fighting was a really big issue back then. Later on, his motto, which was, "No man in the wrong can stand up against a fellow that's in the right and keeps on a-coming." Those are the Rangers' creed. So the Texas Rangers have a fascinating history. I know that didn't a month or so ago you had someone come in and talk about them? And I missed the lecture, I'm sorry I did, but it was a lot of fun. So that's what's neat about, all these things that you can go in and look at. So here we got a couple more Texas Rangers. You like these outfits? You could spend so many times. I came across one where there were guys dressed like this, and they were literally shooting across the Rio Grande at bandits over there. And you couldn't tell them apart. It's like, who are they shooting at? They all were dressed the same, you know? So, all right. County law enforcement. Taylor County, that's what we're up to. Listen, I'm talking awful fast, but... and realizing, I was going... When my husband was watching me work on this, start a couple weeks, he said, "I don't know, I'm going to talk for that long." We're not going to make it through all my slides, I can tell you that. All right, county law enforcement. Remember, once you have a state, you start seeing counties being organized. So as the counties are organized, a sheriff is elected or appointed. County commissioners are elected or appointed. It just depends on the progress of the political environment, right? So, in Taylor County, one of our first sheriffs was John Valentine. And as you notice, he got elected, and then he didn't, and then he resigned, and he got elected. It was a whole bunch of back and forth there, all right? But actually, he wasn't the first sheriff, because where was the first courthouse? Buffalo Gap. So, James Jim Carter was appointed sheriff in 1878. And he was actually the first sheriff for Taylor County, when Buffalo Gap was the county seat. 1879 is when we saw the first district court meet in this area. So before that, we were all the way in Oklahoma, and I'll come back to that district court up there. County sheriff runs everything from just so when you're looking at county crimes, investigating crimes, they handle the sentence offenders, they enforce criminal and traffic laws, and realize they all do it in the county. So I hear this question continuously from students. They'll go, why don't they enforce the laws in Abilene? Because that's a different jurisdiction. In Abilene, you have the Abilene Police Department. Taylor County Sheriff's deputies work outside of it. Now, they do have the authority, but that's not their jurisdiction. So typically they won't. So you go, well, how come I got a ticket here and not here from this guy and not that guy? But the major thing that the county sheriff is charged with in every county in Texas is the jail. That's their major job. Right? That's their number one job, is supposed to be the jail. Now, they appoint an administrator in a lot of the bigger counties, but that is what they are charged with by the Constitution. All right. Then we get to early day police departments. Remember back over there with New York City? This is what was going on in Abilene. This was actually a picture from the 1950s. It was undated. I couldn't find one of the original Abilene Police Department. I'm sure there's one out there. But unless I wanted to get on another little dog trail, I would have never gotten back. So I was very careful. It really wasn't until after the Civil War that we saw police departments start dressing like this and carrying guns. So before the Civil War, we really didn't do that, especially in the bigger cities. And just as a sidebar, there was a big objection to police originally wearing uniforms because of the fact it was associated with the military. So this is way back in the 1800s. In New York and Boston, citizens didn't want their police officers armed, and they didn't want them in uniforms because it reminded them of what they left. Which is kind of interesting when you look at, today's context where now we're going to the militarization of police departments, where they don't look like this, now they look like SWAT teams. So that's another social story there. Okay. All right. In the city, we also had a marshal. The first city marshal was John Hill. Now, I really don't know if he's any relation. Is he any relation to the current John Hill? Is that Hill family the same? I don't know. What's fun is when you're looking at all these names and dates and everything, you keep seeing similar names. Because you got to realize how few people lived in some place like Texas. So if you moved out here, gone to Texas, from Missouri, and you had a big family, and they spread out across the western area, you saw those names repeatedly in town after town. And so what's one nice thing about me not knowing these names is that I don't know who I'm offending when I'm telling a story about, someone named, where's her? I liked her. Where'd she go? You had a Mr. Frizzle that was executed. You have a Mrs. Frizzle, another, and I recognize this name from Abilene, but I'm going to assume it's probably the other arm of the family, that went to Dallas and was a very well-known lady of the night. So it's kind of cool when you look back at these 1800 newspapers, you'll see those same names show up and you're going, really? You know? But remember, they also had like 12 and 15 kids back then. So those names went well across the community. All right. In the early 1800s, your town marshal was typically your chief police officer, law enforcement officer, until you had a city council form, and then you would start seeing a police department develop. Okay? So there we are on the frontier. Indians, everybody out there. Right. This is just a little bit of a dateline, real rough, because in the early 1800s, you had Mexican colonial prisons, and we did have 5 or 6 jails during that time spread across Texas. San Antonio, that was Bexar County, Nacogdoches. What's the other one? It's more over there too, because that was considered the civilized part of Texas, right? That was more than here. 1836 is when we see county sheriffs are authorized to buy or rent structures for incarcerating prisoners. So, if you notice, we're into the Republic. So there was no money to do this. They were just authorized to do it. If the city fellows didn't pay for it, they didn't have a jail. But in order to get people into a new community, you needed a jail. And quite often our jails predated the courthouse. Because if you want to go live in some new town out there, let's go out and live in Midland. And there's nothing out there in Midland, a jail makes it seem safer. So they would actually advertise back to Houston, Dallas, Galveston, when you started seeing jails come in. 1945, Texas was annexed, and we saw an unfunded mandate about the construction of jails. Every county in Texas, according to the Constitution that was ratified at that time, had to have a jail. Again, no money. So we saw, this is where your terms, Hooskow, calaboose, the dungeon, whatever it was, they would build a jail. Typically in a lot of the more remote areas, you would have a county center, a city center. So that was usually where your city well was, if you wanted to go get water. So they would typically just handcuff someone there to the well until someone came in from a local community that had a jail or had a sheriff or had a marshal. All those people were overlapping. So basically in the early days in a lot of these areas, they literally just tried to hold someone. So we'll see the different ways they hold them. All right. You see in 1848, this is on the heels of Texas being annexed and they were working with the Constitution, the Texas State Penitentiary was established. All right? You see the other date I put here, executions became the responsibility of the state. That wasn't until 1923. So that's why when you look at old jails, they all have some way, most of them have a way of executing someone because they were the ones who were supposed to do it at the county level. And that has a whole social history to it too, and that you wanted to know who you were executing. This wasn't supposed to be this, we're going to take someone, put them behind a door, and nobody knows it's happening. You wanted the community to know that we were going to enforce law and order in our town. So that's why it was at the county level. So it wasn't until 23 that it becomes the state's responsibility. And that's well after the penitentiary was established. You see? So it's all part of the social fabric, which is just so fascinating out here. All right, frontier law enforcement. Now I thought this was interesting. Now see, here we got Jim Miller here too, named from Abilene. He's like, surely this isn't the same guy. Look at this. It's not just the vigilante justice, which was pretty common back then because you didn't have any place to take these guys. It's the fact that this is a postcard. So this is what this came from. I came across this whole collection of postcards that had everything from executions to hangings to just, plain old whatever, everyday scenes that you could mail to your friends and family. So let's show what's happening out there. I do this all the time, I go faster. Okay. Vigilante justice, when I started looking through this, there's some really good books out there on hangings and vigilante justice in Texas. Apparently during the late 1800s, Shackelford County in particular had a lot of hangings because they were having a lot of problems with cattle rustling. So it became so bad, I quit counting, nobody else was coming. Here was one example. 1876, numerous accounts of hangings for cattle theft. I.E. May, on the Clear Fork Creek outside of Fort Griffin, a white man named Hot, yes, I'm saying it right, was hanged after being caught with stolen horses. A placard was fixed to his body which read, "Horse thief number 5, that killed and escaped," which is in spelling, it's probably scalloped, "boy for Indian sign. Shall horse thieves rule this country? He shall have company soon." So apparently up there, if you stole a cow, you were hung. I mean, there wasn't no, fooling around with this. And this was the 1876, that particular year, there were at least a dozen hangings. So it really went on for quite a while. All right. Now we're going to come back to Judge Parker. And Judge Parker was the judge who our deputy, just went blank on his name, back on the earlier slide, the black man. Bass, thank you, worked for. He was one of the many deputies that worked for him. Judge Parker was actually known as the hanging judge because under him, 160 men were hung. Now what's interesting is that he was typically at this time period, the federal courts were more civil. However, he operated in Indian territory, so he heard the Indian and Mexican complaints. So he also operated a criminal court, which was highly unusual at that time. In spite of the fact he was called the hanging judge, he heard over 17,000 cases. So what I found interesting, though, and I'm going to refer to my notes here because in 1875, a U.S. Marshal's salary was $90 a month, and the deputies also received mileage, 6 cents per mile. Now, I don't know how you figured that out on a horse. No, it's just coming, right? They also received, upon delivery, $2 for each summons or prisoner delivered. The court paid for the cost of transporting the prisoners, and that transport was a prisoner wagon, which we're going to see is that. So if you got picked up, this is what you got to ride to the court in. Judge Parker didn't believe in the old saying, bring him in dead or alive. He wanted to have a trial and let the judge, decide their sentence. And he was very equal in this. Now I think this is interesting because if you compare his numbers to current day court statistics, you won't see the same distribution. He only hung one woman, and the races were equally divided by thirds, whites, blacks, and Indians. During his appointment, he tried over 17,000 cases, and of those sentenced, only 1% were sent to the gallows. Now, he felt so strongly about criminals having the right to be heard that if a marshal killed a prisoner in transit, he had to pay for the prisoner's funeral, casket, and headstone. So he wanted them alive, and that was close to $60. So that was what's kind of cool. Even though you hear he was the hanging judge, he didn't hang everybody, and he wanted them to come to him. So he didn't encourage vigilante justice. He wanted that inmate to be heard. If you look at something like, okay, I can tell by my age group, everybody knows who Marshal Dillon is. Marshal Dillon, typically, he was a U.S. Marshal, but he was paid by the city that he worked for, but he also was paid per head. So in order to make any kind of salary, he had to go out there and bring in these guys and then turn them over to the judge. Now, what's interesting, if you think about, when you think about all those old Marshals, he never did really like to kill the people. That's why, because it cost him more money. It was better for him to turn in the guy alive, because the area that he worked in was under this judge's jurisdiction. And those are the kind of little stories that I get sidetracked on. I was like, oh, that's really cool, you know? I like it. All right, the tumbleweed wagons. These are kind of cool, because they were actually developed by a steamboat blacksmith and his brother up in Missouri. As you know, your territory going across, he was a blacksmith and he could see that people were settling in the frontier. And he came upon this idea that if he could figure out some way for people to actually get justice, he could make money off of this. So he developed these little tumbleweed type wagons, which is actually a cell on wheels, right? And he sold these across the western United States, either to the federal district or the state district, wherever it is. You'll also see these in other forms, and they're kind of cool. Now the particular company was Poly, and Poly only recently went out of business. So for years, this is how they made their money, was jails. And we got a strapped iron jail, okay? This is out in Palo Pinto County. So you take the little jail cell, sit it on the ground, and you have a jail. Now, how many of you have been out there to like Candelaria? I remember years ago when we drove out there, you go out there on this dead-end road, and there's one of these sitting there, and we're standing there going, damn, But what they do is they would lock whoever it was in, and they would wait for a marshal or a local sheriff to come by and pick that person up. Now, if you notice, there's no facilities in here. There's when we became a republic and everybody had to have a jail in their county? Well, I don't know if you've noticed all the signs in town about the sewer system. Some people want a sewer system in Buffalo Gap, some people don't want a sewer system in Buffalo Gap. I don't know the politics behind it, I don't care. But you can imagine the same kind of confrontation if I said, okay, we're all going to build a jail, how much do you want to donate? Yeah, some people would go, yeah, let's do that, other people not. So jails, this kind of thing would cost several $100s. Or you could go out in many areas, they literally would just dig a pit, line it with wood, put some wood on top, put a hatch, and throw the guy in there. And then they would wait for justice to show up. So you had a lot, early days, you really didn't want to be in these kinds. Can you imagine sitting out in the Texas sun in this waiting? There's another one in Presidio County. This now sits in Marfa. I heard it got moved. So what we see later on, this one's in Montgomery County. You take this, early in the history of Montgomery County, what they did was they took one of these strap iron jail cells and just built a jail around it. So there's your cell. So all you had to do was build you a little building on it, give you some place if you had a sheriff and his family, because typically in the early jails, the sheriff would live right next to it. His wife would be the one that would feed and make sure the guy was clean. What a job, right? But this would be the independent jail. And if you go up here, you can see the cell is separate from the building because they built them separately and then put them in. I don't even know the technology of that. But it's fun because you go back to some of the old articles and you can find that. How did they do that? How did they get into the building? All right? Alapinta County. Right? This was one of the guys that was executed by Judge, whatever his name was, the federal judge. Right? This was how they hung the people at the federal courts. They'd set it up. Huntsville State Prison, that didn't come in until 1849. Now, this is the very early, if you know anything about, have heard anything about the Huntsville State Prison, this is called the Walls. All right? No blacks were incarcerated in the early years, they just hung them or whipped them. In many cases, they would just rent them out to local farmers, is how they dealt with that. They weren't separate. Remember this when you look at the, and I'm talking fast because I know y'all we're running out of time and y'all are shut up. In the early jail system, in the early state prison system, women, juveniles, insane people, they were all locked up together. Even today you do the same thing, but you tend to have a wall between them. But back then they just all went in the same thing together. So remember when I was talking about that little hole where you look back at the strap iron? You know, and you murdered your husband and this guy murdered his wife and you're stuck in there at the same time? You know, that's the way it was. Or you had a kid that stole something, you stuck in there too. Everybody in there together. All right. I kind of thought this was cool because this guy, I'll give you a chance to read it. I'll give you a chance to have a drink of water. This was 1886. Now if you notice, he was drinking and he was sent to the state prison. And when our new city attorney at that particular time starts to come down on gambling. Apparently, I don't know if that was part of the Texas Rangers and their vendetta against boxing. I don't know why that. I really want to know that. I might be able to look that up right now. See, that's what happens. Okay? Texas inmate labor, this is what we used to do with our first inmates when they brought them in. We expanded the jails back then, instead we just rented them out. It was called the lease system. And if you're interested in the correctional, this is something I do teach a lot on, is the correctional facilities. There's a fascinating history behind the whole Texas prison system. Everything from the lease system to today. They didn't eliminate that until the 1970s. And actually, when you look at the conditions of our jails, here's Buffalo Gap Jail. Remember, our jails came in the 1850s. It wasn't until 1976 that Texas enacted laws governing the sanitation, health, and welfare of the inmates. So prior to that time, however you took care of your county inmates was, what's the saying, you know, what happened in your county stayed in your county? So there was no regulation, virtually no regulation. In the 1970s, it's kind of interesting because it impacts the architecture too. We start seeing regulation come in, and of course there's inspections and there's money, there's a whole big Texas criminal justice system that's established to overlook at these jails. So that, during the next 10 to 20 years, is when we lose historic jail after historic jail. Because all of a sudden, even though this was not one of them, this moved for another reason, this type jail that had existed for years in Mills County or Palo Pinto County or someplace like that, they didn't meet the criteria. Because have you been in the jail up here? You know, like I said, you go to the bathroom, there's no running water, there's nothing. And many jails in the 1970s were still like that. You know, you didn't want to go out to West Texas and be imprisoned. Right? This was, we got a couple of sheriff's deputies shooting at each other, which was kind of, they were all, and this was from 1886 too. 1800 was really crazy out there. Okay? And I'm going to just show you a couple pictures that, I'm sorry I ran so long. You want me to stop now? No. Stop? Okay. All right, I'll go back. All right, here's our 1885 Taylor County calaboose. This is what was up there, and this is it. Okay? So in 1885, we saw a calaboose in Abilene. This is the same time that this jail was still being used. So, but this is what the calaboose looked like. Oh, wait, go back. We'll go back to that one. See it? Wooden building, no windows. You just lock them in there. Okay? Many of these early buildings, the basic problem is, now, different cities had different construction. It could be underground. You would see some, there was one in San Antonio that was really cool because they built a 2-story one with stairs going up the side, and they'd take the inmates up there and just throw them in. So no bathrooms, no water, nothing. That's what they did with them. But if you notice it's wood, what can you do? Right? They try to burn them down, they try to dig their way out. So that's the reason that Poly Company and other jail companies developed, was to start building metal jails instead of the wooden ones. So it's kind of cool. I mean, I like that. Look at that. Can you imagine being locked up for that? All right. See, this is one where they were trying to break him out. They tried setting fire to the jail with their friends inside. Luckily, the wood was wet enough that it didn't burn up. Did they think through this? Yeah, is there a problem here with this jail escape? You know, didn't work. Okay, 1891, there's the county courthouse. Here's the county jail. You see we have the calaboose and the county jail. So it's moved from Buffalo Gap to there. All right? And that's what it looked like. Really cool. Now, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, you saw really, and if you need to go, just go, because I'll just keep talking. That was the height of jail construction in Texas, because we were after the Civil War, people were settling the West, and this was something to be proud of. Look how proud our city is. We have this cool jail, and actually the courthouse looked really neat too. And this is where you're going to be safe if you move to Abilene. You know, and we'll kill them too. You know, we got an execution thing in there too to kill them. Now, originally when they started building jails, they quite often attached them to the courthouse. The problem with that was it was a good idea in one way, because you didn't have that transport problem where you're trying to take them out of the jail to the courthouse. It was a misinformation that if you burned the records in the county courthouse, that it would destroy like your tax bill, your deeds, that kind of stuff. So if you burned it, so what they wound up to, they had several courthouses burned and the jails burned too, because they're trying to destroy the county records. So they started separating the jail. As you go further into the 1900s, We also didn't want to see the jail. Inmates, even though the courthouse was right there, so we started seeing it go further and further out. So that's why in Abilene, the jail's out on South 27th, is that where it is? Yeah, moved from there. When they tore this building down, I just thought I'd put this in here. They made it into this building. Recycling at its best. All right, had someone who sought out of the jail. Okay, really, picture, okay. Taylor County Courthouse, here's that jail. I'm gonna run through these. This is Fort Griffin, and I know we're out of time, so I'm just gonna run through some little pictures. This is just the first public. Shackelford County. This was built at $17,000. That's a lot of money. Now, a lot of these are still standing. Some, like I said, in the 70s and 80s got torn down when they wanted to build the new jails. Lubbock. Now, when they first built the jail in Lubbock, that was also where all the churches met. In most cities, in a lot of the frontier cities, it was the first public building built. So if you wanted to have church or social services, you had them there. Matador. This one cost $38. That one's still standing. There's a lot of neat ones out there. And I'm just running through these real quick because 1903. We saw a lot of these in the 1800s to early 1900s. They really, really got elaborate. Let me go back. As far as the construction, this is when you see this type of really elaborate construction. And then you start going into that utilitarian look. Like if you see the old courthouse in Abilene at the corner of Peach and 4th, that 1950s, I think is when that got built, and it's just a really ugly building. So we went to that utilitarian look and went away from these really, let's make it a corner. Anyway, I'm going to stop because I'm sorry, I'm running the whole hour and I didn't think I'd even run 15 minutes.